This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, welcome everyone. This is Ashley with Practicing Life podcast. In today's podcast, I am joined with Rebecca Jane, a relationship therapist from Yorkshire. Our discussion focuses on the topic of women feeling trapped in their relationships. With years of experience studying and analyzing relationships, both in her personal and professional life, Rebecca Jane has identified a common pattern in therapy sessions: unfulfilling marriages, where women feel stuck. And so that is going to be today's podcast. And Rebecca Jane, in her passion to support women and to help them feel validated, she has authored a book titled A Survival Guide for Women Who Feel Stuck in Their Marriage. Should I Stay or Leave? So welcome, Rebecca. I'm so happy to have you on the show, and I love the topic.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. So for anyone in my audience, as you know, we talk about all different things, and everything in life is a choice. And so bringing Rebecca on here is going to be so great, because I believe that once we get into the whole podcast and our discussions, we'll be able to talk about both sides of the coin, both sides of the fences, staying or going. So please stay tuned. Now, Rebecca, let's hear it. How did this all come about? Let's hear your story and what got you here today, writing this book, showing up on this podcast.
Okay, so I've been married about 15, I've been with my husband about 15 years. We've been married about 11 years now. And I haven't been a relationship therapist that whole time, but I think I started to notice a huge shift in the way I was feeling in married life when children came along. And I think I didn't really understand it at the time, being a new mother and still in my 20s at the time as well. And I just remember everything changing in my relationship. Obviously, your priorities shift, and obviously priorities shift to the children, and focusing on trying to obviously get by every single day with all the jobs and looking after the children and working and whatever you have kind of going on. Your relationship takes obviously a huge kind of back seat. And I just remember throughout my late 20s and my 30s feeling really kind of confused in my relationship, really kind of confused in my marriage. It's hard for me to kind of to go back to that time to understand why, because I didn't really understand why I was feeling so, not necessarily trapped as such at the time, more kind of confused and stuck with, unable to understand how to navigate it, I suppose, because what would happen is we would disagree on everything, parenting probably being the major kind of thing that we would disagree on. And I think until I became a relationship therapist and understood it from a completely different perspective and was able to put the links together, because I think when people hear this title or see this book, they instantly might think, oh, well, I'm bashing men, or I'm saying something bad about my husband, which is the complete opposite. When I became a relationship therapist, I actually was able to understand it from my own patterns of behavior and put it right back to my early environment and my childhood, and also all of my previous relationships throughout my 20s before I even got married. I had a similar pattern of behavior in how I was in my romantic relationships. And when I understood it from a relationship therapist perspective and put all the links together, finally things started to make sense for me. And that's why I decided to write the book, because I thought it's such a confusing time for women, especially when they become mothers, that yeah, I just wanted to help women to peel back the layers and to understand it and have a deeper meaning around it.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you from my own personal experience, having children changed everything. I mean, it changed the roles, the time available, my energy to be able to divide against work, kids, husband, friends. And then somewhere in there, I lost self-care. That's my journey.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
yeah, so I'm really glad to have you here so that we can kind of talk about this, because it is nice to know up front that this isn't about male bashing. And it also just, and based on what I do, I'm a hypnotist, I'm a coach, I'm always working with people, and so much of who we are today is what was replicated to us in our childhood. So I would love to like hear a little bit more just from you, as this is something I'm always coaching on, and when I coach people, I'm always going back. The past is gone. The only reason to go back in the past is to have understanding of what you're doing today and make a choice to do something different. But so like, did you see yourself mimicking your parents? Did you see your husband mimicking his parents? Like once children came, like, cause that, like,
Yeah.
I think that's where it changed for my husband and I personally. Like, I feel like we were both very much like two people who had separated from being the child and no longer following your parents' order. Do you know what I mean? Like teens, they start to separate, they start to pull away from their parents, they get their own identity, and then you marry within that identity, but then you have kids and it's like you revert. So you lose some type of identity and revert to this image of what you've understood parenting to be.
Yeah, of course. I think what a lot of people, and certainly something I never knew until I became a relationship therapist, is that a lot of our childhood trauma or childhood emotional baggage that we still carry with us will resurface in our romantic relationships. It doesn't resurface straight away. It's usually when that honeymoon period starts to wear off, and lots of kind of inner child wounds will start to come to the surface. So when you have children of your own, that is a huge point when a lot of childhood trauma will resurface, because you're you're still carrying so much kind of this emotional baggage around with you, and then you're kind of projecting it through the way that we bring up our children or the conditions that we place on them. And obviously it's all unconscious, we don't actually realize that we're doing a lot of that. So yeah, definitely, if I was to look at my marriage, both of us were replicating our childhood environments. I was, if I just kind of give you a bit of background, what I mean by that, I'm a very avoidant type in relationships, or I certainly used to be before I kind of worked on myself. Whereas I would hugely kind of withdraw and shut down if I ever felt I was criticized or I was judged on any level. Whereas he would be more craving attention and wanting me to be with him all the time. So you've got those kind of conflicting
The polarization right
yeah,
there.
absolutely. So we were literally at loggerheads because we had two completely different perceptions of what a romantic relationship should look like.
Yeah. And so like for you, if I understand this correctly, you got married and then became a relationship.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Therapist. Okay. So like when you're in your role as a therapist, do you kind of feel like there's a common theme with the amount of time for people to kind of have that honeymoon versus like have kids? Like, you know what I mean? Do people like that you're working with typically have kids in the honeymoon, after the honeymoon? Like, what are you really working with when, is there any commonality?
I think it just varies from person to person, really. I think the honeymoon period can last up to about 2 years sometimes, but I think from the moment people have children, if they go into a relationship and have children pretty quickly within the first year, then I imagine, it probably took me a couple of years before I had a child. So I did initially have that kind of 2-year honeymoon period. But I think from the moment anybody has a child, the honeymoon period probably is over quite quickly, and those childhood wounds and that emotional baggage will start to resurface, because you're not just it's not just coming out against your partner, those childhood wounds. It will come out with your, how you feel about yourself and how you feel you are as a mother or as a parent in general. So you're projecting a lot of those wounds onto your children as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I definitely hear people all the time say, like, I sound like my mother here, so but okay, so I want to go back a little bit. And let's talk about you, because you wrote this book for a reason. You wrote this book because this probably affected you in your own life as well as in your professional. So like, what is something that like you learned through this whole process, like writing this book? What has really changed for you?
Self-worth. Everything for me came back down to my self-worth. And I think I don't know how to answer this question. So I was a child brought up in the 80s. Women were very kind of conditioned in that generation to put other people's needs before their own. Mm-hmm. And so when I went into my romantic relationships, I felt it was my role to rescue people, to save people, to fix people, to be that nurturer for everyone. And obviously putting myself at the bottom of the list. And I think that's probably the most common pattern I will see. Because typically women, what I notice in the therapy room is a huge wave of women in their late 30s and 40s going through this transition, going through this kind of awakening period. And it all comes down to the same kind of conditioning. They feel that they can't step away from their marriage or their relationship because they're going to hurt somebody else. And obviously that's difficult when children are involved, but a lot of the time they struggle to leave their partner because of how they're going to make him feel, or but he won't cope without me, or what can I, he's going to really kind of struggle, and I'm going to be the cause of that. And it all seems to be this same kind of conditioning, that she believes that she has to kind of fix everyone and rescue everyone, and just neglects herself, and puts her mental health at the bottom of the list.
And so do you see that people wait until they're at a breaking point before they really get help, or at what point do they come to you?
Sorry, Ashley, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So at what point do people come to you? Is it at their breaking point? Is it at like you got to a point where you were really confused, and then you started getting to a point where you're like, I need more resources here?
Yeah, I think if I was to look at it from my perspective, when you become a therapist, you have to have quite a lot of therapy yourself. So that was probably the main time where I started to have therapy and kind of strip back my conditioning and understand it from a different perspective. So I was probably not forced into therapy, but that was part of my training. I had to go into therapy to kind of analyze myself and my patterns. But when I see women in the therapy room, then yes, it's at breaking point, usually when they're in this kind of cycle where they've reached rock bottom, they want to leave, but they have so much guilt and so much kind of fear attached to that they're looking for somebody just to kind of help validate them, help them to kind of navigate it, because whenever we kind of step into the unknown, it's so scary, it's so unfamiliar that people don't often decide to do that until they're literally at rock bottom.
Yeah. And I just tell my audience too, at this point, I mean, she's a relationship therapist. I'm a coach. I see this too a lot in my work. And I know that this is exactly how the brain works. Most people, if you're listening, most people will not make the change until the current circumstance is so painful, like they're in boiling water and they have to hop out, and they will stay in that circumstance while it boils until it gets to a point that it is too hot, that it is damaging to their own like soul, their own spirit. And then they're jumping out, and it no longer matters when they jump out what they have to face, because they know what they're in is so challenging. And so, but I'm just telling all my audiences now, there's choices here. There's a different way to do this. And, and I would also agree with Rebecca. I find a lot, I mean, this is one of the reasons why everything around my coaching is around self-love. To me, the golden rule is self-love, and everything stems from there. That is your foundation. That is your block. So when Rebecca's talking about a lot of women are struggling with the self-worth aspect, underneath self-worth is self-love. And so they are connected. But self-worth is a pillar to self-love. And so I find it super interesting, because I also was born in the 80s, right? I also went through this. Because you can think, oh, I'm so successful in my career. Well, for me, I always felt like I was the best mom, so I didn't have those type of issues. But at the end of the day, when I was looking at the struggles in my marriage, and when I was, dealing with all of these I had relationship with my husband and relationship with my teenager that I both had to address. So relationships were kind of my wake up, like, this isn't working. I'm not doing something right. And at the end of the day, for me personally, it also was coming down to the fact of I was people pleasing. I was putting everybody's needs first. I was always last. And I got to a point where I was drowning. And instead of looking at, and this is where I want to go to next, kind of talking about the men's, but I went from having this relationship with my husband where I just thought, like, what's in art, we have all of these things, like the best things since sliced bread, we have all these little things. I just thought he was something so amazing. And then as I took, honestly, this was my choice, but it was also my conditioning. I took everything on, the cooking, all of the burdens, right? The cooking, the cleaning, the taking kids to the doctors, knowing what everybody was doing, where they were going. I was the coordinator for everything. I was making my husband's freaking doctor appointments. I was taking on everything. And I was also everybody's emotional stability. So he had a bad day. It was my job to like change it, right? I put myself in that role. I mean, I've done a lot of my own coaching on this, and I can look back, but the whole point of this is I just got to a point where it wasn't even resentful. I looked at my husband like, I don't like you at all. Like, and like, there's nothing that you do for me. You are nothing but a problem. That's where I had gotten to my relationship. And so where I am today is a lot different, but I am not that same person. So in my relationship, and you can kind of talk about what you see, but I no longer make myself responsible for anybody's emotions. 2, I no longer make myself responsible for fixing their problems. I let them sit in it. I let them sit in that boiling water, and I just sit there and be like, there's another choice. I'm there as just guidance. I am not there as a fixer. And then like 3, I stopped taking everything on. I drew a line. I created boundaries. And I was like, you can make your own appointments. You can do the kids' laundry. You can do this. Like, we are sharing this responsibility. It is no longer on me. So these are some of the things I did. And that helped me change how I felt about my husband. So go from what you see in your personal life and as well as your professional.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could mirror that, to be honest. And, it's not anyone's fault. It's, we're so heavily conditioned in childhood to believe that that's our role. And that's what as women, that's what we are. We have to kind of look after and nurture everybody else. But I think and I think, in our 20s and our 30s, we're so unconscious that we don't actually realize. And every time we have a kind of feeling of, oh, well, this isn't right, we instantly feel guilt, or we instantly feel like '30s and our 40s, especially, we wake up from that and we're just like, oh, okay, so just because I've been conditioned this way, I don't have to continue living this way. I can actually change my beliefs. I can actually change my conditioning and live differently. Of course, it takes time to break through that. I'm not going to say that that's easy at all, because a lot of guilt and fear will resurface when we try to change our identity. But as you kind of move into later, well, I wouldn't say later life, 40s is still very young these days, but as we kind of progress into that decade, we certainly start to wake up from a lot of this. And, with regards to males, they've been conditioned as well, and they're very unconscious to the fact of how they're contributing to the relationship breakdown. Because I see so many males in the therapy room who don't understand that the emotional connection is absolutely essential when it comes to intimacy for a female. And he thinks that he's doing all these jobs, and he's like, I can't understand why she still doesn't want any intimacy with me. And I'm like, well, let's look at the emotional connection. But the male and female brain, they're so different that it just misaligning all the time. So it's really about kind of stripping back all the layers and seeing it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I will tell you that was also in our marriage, and that's still an area of growth for my husband, because he definitely has a association. So this is also what I do with coaching, right? It's about learning what your brain associates something to, and that's what helps you break brain patterns and beliefs. So when you can identify what you're associating something with, like I'm going to give you, for example, on me. I associated sacrifice with love. So if I wasn't sacrificing, then I wasn't showing up as a loving partner. I wasn't showing up as a loving mom. So as long as I maintained that association and and that belief system, I was going to continue to sacrifice my time, my energy, my health, even, to make sure, because it was so important to me to be a loving person. I valued that. Okay. So if we shift that over to my husband and share a male perspective, which he wouldn't mind me sharing this, he associated like acts with like love. So he's like, I don't know what else you want from me. Like, he's like, I did this bucket list. That's it. And I was like, yeah, but we haven't had one conversation outside of where are you going to be? When are you going to be? Like, what are the kids doing? I was like, you haven't asked me one question. He's like, I asked you how your day was. And I'm like, yeah, but you didn't ask anything with that. You didn't dig, like,
Of course.
so he had to really learn that for him, he did not have emotional maturity. Like, so it's what's interesting, like how you brought at the very beginning of the conversation, you were talking about one of your partners was avoidant and one of them was attached. So those are those polar opposites. Well, just as a perspective for all the audience, my husband isn't a person who is attached, but avoidant to emotions. So he needs my attention. He needs it. Like, it is a need within him, but he doesn't attach to any emotions. So if he starts feeling anything other than anger, because anger is okay for him, being funny and being angry and being neutral, those are his three emotions, and those are all okay for him. But to have any other emotion for him was wrong inside. That's his belief system. Like, he as a male wasn't allowed to feel anything else like that. And so his emotional maturity, we've been working on this for a couple of years now, it slowly grows, he had to be reconditioned that it is okay to have different emotions. It is okay to have, instead of feeling like anger, get underneath that. What is really at the core? What fear are you really feeling? And what can we do about this? And I would say, oh, you know, for him, and I'm sure a lot of other men are this way, he's so fixated on being the provider that's like, that was it. He was like, well, if I help you with certain man, things that are harder for women to do, and I am a provider, my checklist is done. He's like, I can check out. That's not the way it works.
No. Absolutely. And you've hit the nail on the head. That, I mean, that's the biggest issue that we will have with couples. It's the emotional maturity. The females are so much more advanced than the males. And again, due to their conditioning, if we look back at the 80s, it was okay for young girls to talk and gossip with their friends and talk about their feelings and emotions. If I looked at my three brothers, and not my parents' fault, there's no blame there, but it was very much like, boys don't cry, boys don't show emotion. They were very conditioned. So even now that we're all in our 40s, it is still very much now, like, one of my parents passed away, and the way we all dealt with our grief was so different because of our conditioning, even though we were all brought up in the same generation and the same household, so yeah, it's very much the emotional maturity levels play a big factor in relationship breakdowns today.
Yeah, and I just want to share this with the audience too, because like in my personal experience, my husband, I thought he had an anger problem, but when we really sat down and we did coaching and, we worked with different therapists, what it really was is he had an anxiety problem that was masked as anger. And he did not understand that. And I didn't understand it either. I mean, this is even before my coaching days. I became a coach after I learned all of these things, like, your wake up call. But, for him, and I've been with my husband since I was 16. So we are, we know each other. We know each other from kids. We know each other through all of these different phases of life. And I would have never said he has an anxiety issue. I would have never said that because he's such a dynamic, charismatic, he's just that outgoing person. I couldn't fathom in my brain, oh, he's feeling anxiety. He doesn't know what to do with it in his body. And so it's coming out as anger. I know so much more now. So I want to talk to you really quickly because, like, one of the aspects that you mentioned in the details of your book as kind of like a book description is that you help women to completely see a different perspective so they no longer view their partner as an enemy. What can you say about that?
Well, I think, like, if we kind of I think, like, if you were to look at, like, the emotional outbursts, that's very common. That is what we do see in a lot of males, that underneath all this anger is so much fear. And again, due to the kind of emotional maturity levels, women will often tolerate these kind of emotional outbursts whilst the children may be young, or as she's kind of too busy in motherhood to kind of really kind of focus on the relationship. But as she comes into her late 30s and 40s, this is something she's not willing to tolerate anymore. And I think it really is important. I don't even know if I'm answering the question here, if I'm going on a different kind of topic, but it's really kind of important that both partners get therapy. And I think what we kind of see a lot of is the female willing to kind of reach out and get help, but the male being a lot more resistant because there's so much fear attached. And because if you look at the kind of generation that they grew up in, where they weren't allowed to be vulnerable, they weren't allowed to kind of talk about feelings and emotions, this is so foreign to them, that every time they go to kind of push themselves out of their comfort zone, I mean, yourself, whenever you're afraid of something, those physical sensations in your body can be crippling sometimes. I always feel it in my chest when I'm afraid or I don't feel good enough about something. I literally feel like heart palpitations. So for males as well, the thought of kind of having to be vulnerable, and to kind of, in order to kind of grow and evolve so that she doesn't leave him, because this is, you know, such a common pattern that we see. She reaches her tether and she can't carry on anymore. He knows he's got to change, otherwise she's going to leave the relationship. And so the prospect of therapy for a male, or to kind of tap into a different side of himself, is just so crippling and so kind of fear-provoking.
Yeah, you know, I will say that I was brought up, even as a female, I can't speak for everybody else, but as a female, I was brought up that it was not okay to ask for help. You figure it out or you're not competent. And I think that's how a lot of men are raised too, as a generalization. That doesn't mean everybody is in the same bucket, but I think it's like a double whammy when you like society, culture, the way you are brought up, you're not allowed to be vulnerable. And then on top of that, to ask for help, you're no longer competent either. And these are brain associations. So again, I think in a lot of ways, it does take that point where one of them is ready to leave, to get enough pain to be able to change something. But I mean, okay. So I will say this is just hands down, my rule of thumb on my personal life is that everything works out exactly how it should. Like everything is a blessing to me. But I wish that I was a different person in the sense that I didn't wait so long, that I didn't tolerate things so long. Like I let myself stay in that boiling water for freaking forever. And I'm not that type of person now. And I can be grateful because those past experiences taught me a valuable lesson so that I no longer continue to tolerate it as this person I am today. But the person I was back then, I wish I would have come along and be like, you don't have to tolerate this. There's another way. So if anybody out there is listening and you're tolerating things, there's another way.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, especially if you're in your 20s or your early 30s, we are very unconscious to a lot of our patterns in those kind of age groups. And sometimes it takes us to reach rock bottom before we're willing to kind of try something new, and kind of put stronger boundaries in place. So, you know, it's really kind of important. And I think this is something else that my book touches on. We have to kind of pay attention to our own patterns. We can't always blame our partner or look to change our partner, because they may change initially what you don't like in them, but then there's always going to be something else and something else, because you can leave that relationship and go into another one, but unless you are deconstructing your own patterns, you're only going to subconsciously attract the same type of partner over and over again. So, you know, my book very much focuses on your own patterns and how you can focus on yourself and deconstruct all of that first and foremost.
Yeah, I really love that you said that. And I also love that it is in your book, because like, I know when I was going through my counseling and I was considering, well, I wasn't considering, I told my husband I wanted a divorce. The divorce was there. But I remember when they were working on me and me doing shadow work, inner work, working on the things that I needed to come through to get to the other side. One of the things that, you know, my therapist, coach, and everything said to me was like, if you don't address these issues, you're just going to wind up in the same relationship. And I was like, no way. I've done so much work and I'm a coach now and I know how the brain works. And I'm telling you, it is so freaking true. And I also like you're saying, women at a certain age, kind of in that age group, I'm friends with people that are about 5 years to 10 years older than me, just because my maturity level is there. And so, you know, before I really got to the point where I was getting, you know, I wanted a divorce with my husband, before I got to that point, I was watching all of my friends starting to go through divorces. And it was just like a divorce train. Everybody was like going through it. And so while I was going through it, they're already done in other relationships now because a few years had passed. And I watched it. I watched so many of my friends get into, the relationship might have different characteristics to it. Like, for instance, one of my friends found a guy that is much more sensitive, loves to write letters, but the core of their relationship and the core of the issues are exactly the same. So they found different people, and they found people with different traits and different characteristics, but they had the same belief systems and the same values. And so when they got together, they had the same type of fights and the same type of arguments and the same type of conflicts. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And if you were, if I was to look at my own patterns, and I like I said before, I was very avoidant before I became a therapist, and avoidant types, they're always looking for ways people are trying to control them. And unless I was to deconstruct that and break that pattern or that belief system in myself, I was always going to look to my partners and think that they were controlling me in some way. And even if from their perspective they were just trying to do something nice for me, I would perceive it completely differently and be like, well, you're trying to control me, you're trying to stop me from going out, or and it wasn't the way that they were perceiving it at all. So but that belief lived in me, and that's why you have to deconstruct your own patterns.
Yeah, and just to further like address that, so when we, like Rebecca had mentioned, don't look at the other partner to change, don't look at them to blame everything for them. So just speaking of that, and then adding to Rebecca's story that she just shared, is that like, if you think about your relationship with yourself, and that's what I primarily coach, so like this is like my area, right? So if you look at yourself and like, even with yourself, you find things that you don't like about yourself. So it isn't a matter of looking to another person and being like, you need to change and become this perfect person, because you can't even be perfect for your own self. And I don't believe in perfection by any means. I just believe in loving yourself and accepting yourself for where you are and who you are, and knowing that you can make day-to-day small changes to become the person that you want to be. But no matter what happens to you, even in your own way that you process, and you're the only person in this circumstance and something happens to you, like you're in your car, you're alone by yourself, and you think something that you don't want to think. I mean, how much are you able to change who you are? So look at yourself first before you start turning around and being like, oh, well, it's my partner's fault, they need to change, because even you have the own responsibility and commitment to yourself to become the person that you want to be. And so it's always about focusing on what you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, when I became a therapist and studied like the subconscious mind, we're always going to, until we kind of break the pattern or kind of pay attention to the patterns that we have from our early environments, we're always going to look to recreate that in our romantic relationships. So it is all about self-awareness. Before you can kind of move on to anything else, you have to have very strong self-awareness and of your own patterns.
Yeah. And I think that self-awareness is such a gift. I mean, I consider it, I'm a fantasy writer on top of everything. And when I do my interviews, I always tell people like, well, it's not just these books with superpowers. We have superpower. Awareness is a superpower. Loving yourself is a superpower. Like even though we are in this 3D physical world, we are supernatural. And the fact that you can have self-awareness is a superpower, because that's where all change is created. So,
of course. Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree.
So is there anything that you would like to say before we kind of wrap up or touch upon?
I don't think so, Ashley. Just kind of reiterate, I guess how important it is to, if you're kind of feeling this way, or you're feeling kind of stuck or confused, just to kind of reach out and to speak to somebody. And when I was kind of going through this journey, I obviously had a number of therapists in college and things like that when I was training, I didn't always find the right therapist that I would connect with straight away. But it is really important that you kind of work with someone when you're going through this, somebody who's there to validate you and make you feel that you're kind of right to have a voice. The right to be heard and validated is so essential when you're going through this time, because it can be very lonely and very confusing.
Yeah. And just to hit on that, I mean, this is one of the reasons you've written your book. It's a survival guide for women who feel stuck in their marriage. Should I stay, or should I leave? Should I stay or leave? So in that book, I imagine that you probably, I haven't read it yet for the audience to know, I imagine that you have probably not only written about addressing things within yourself, but to look at some of these like other things, like reach out for help when you have this. These are ways that you can feel validated. So do you want to talk about any of that before?
There is a few exercises in the book, and I also kind of touch on a few kind of common cases that I will see in the therapy room, and I help the reader to, I kind of deconstruct it for the reader so they can see it from both points of view, because it's not about blame. It's about two, the different genders having two very different outlooks on life, very different. Their brains are wired very differently. They see things very differently. So if we go into, and I often say this to my clients in the therapy room, if you're coming into therapy and you're coming to bash and blame the other one, you're not going to get very far. To get somewhere on this journey, to kind of really feel better about things and life in general, it's all self-reflection, and it all comes back down to kind of looking inwards. You're going to get a lot further and a lot faster forward if you come at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I also love self-reflection. It goes right there with self-awareness. So I want to thank you so much for coming on to my show and for talking to my audience and helping them. And I'm gonna put in the show notes your website. Do you do any type of reels or anything like that for people to follow you, or?
I'm so new to social media. When I wrote this book, I didn't even think about the promotional side. I was so naive to everything. I am on Facebook under Rebecca Jane, but I'm not on Instagram. I am on LinkedIn, and I do have a website called rebeccajane.uk.
All right. Well, and for anybody in the United States, just as a reminder, you'll need to go to the United Kingdom's Amazon website in order to purchase the book. I will put it in the show notes, and you can, of course, play the pound difference. But I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming on the show, sharing your knowledge, your stories. And I will tell everybody in the audience that you matter, and I will see you next time.
Thanks, Ashley. Bye.